far the most common question I get asked about food is how can I eat better? And you'd think that there'd be a really simple answer to that question, right? I mean, we've had science for centuries, yeah? So surely by now someone has figured it out. Surprisingly, though, we haven't. Not really. And let me explain why then. So let's start with the assumption that when you say how can I eat better, you mean what food is more beneficial to me health wise. And the problem is that no one can be really sure, like no one really agrees on it. And you'd be damn fucking sure if people did know and did start to agree, because someone would be a trillionaire off the back of that little bit of information and everyone would know about it. And the reason why we don't know comes really down to how Western science has chosen to study food. So, firstly, we favour a type of science which is called reductionist science. And this is where we take something really complicated, say for example an apple, and we see what it's made out of. We break it down into smaller and smaller bits until we see at its molecular level exactly what it is. And when we do that, we assume that there's nothing more to the apple than just the sugar and fibre and vitamins and stuff. And because we know what all of these individual little bits do to a human body, or we think we know, that means we think we know what an apple does, like what an apple is. But we forget that an apple is so much more than just an apple. It's a whole combination of the seed that it grew from, the tree that it's in, the side of the tree, the soil, the sun, water, even the farmer that grew it. And no two apples are the same. I mean, they're similar, really similar, but they're not the same. And this is like people. We're similar, but we're definitely not the same. So if you and I were to eat an apple, we're not just digesting it with identical digestive systems. Each one of our bodies would choose how to use that apple depending on things like our age, our gender, our body shape, our gut bacteria, where we live, our beliefs about fruit, what we've eaten earlier and what we're planning to eat later, whether we were hungry when we ate it, and what kind of day or even what kind of life we're having. And there's just no way that science can predict any of that. It just gives us an estimate. It also comes with a belief that if we know what all of the bits are, then we should be able to recreate the apple or the same nutrition of an apple in a lab. So instead of eating it, we can have it in like a pill or a bar form. But is that actually the same as eating an apple? Because personally, I'm not so sure it is. I highly doubt that our body, which has evolved over millions of years to eat the food from the ground, thinks so either. But who the fuck knows? No one knows yet. We don't really know the long-term effects of the food that we eat because we're not allowed to lock people in cages and force feed them stuff to see when they die and what they die of. So instead we use mice for that purpose. So again, we have to guess. And we do that by getting people to fill in food logs. Now, if you've ever used MyFitnessPal, you will know how much humans fucking suck when they try and fill in food logs. Often we rely on our memories, and that is a really, really unreliable way of studying people. Another reason why these kinds of studies can be really, really inaccurate is because we easily make assumptions and our opinions come under a really biased cultural lens. For example, we'd have the assumption that eating, say, KFC twice a day will give you a heart attack. But a person who eats 10 portions of fruit or veg a day will protect against one. And even though they do try to compensate for different lifestyle factors in these kinds of studies, it's not rocket science to assume that the fruit and veg guy will be living a hugely different life to the fried chicken one in almost every aspect. And so the benefits that we apply to the fruit and veg could actually be because this person is living just a generally different, healthier lifestyle than the KFC guy. Because correlation is not proof of causation ever. Reductionist science is really, really great at telling us when we're deficient in something, but it's not that good at predicting what's best for us in the long term, because nutrition science really hasn't been around for long enough yet to to show how accurate it is. It's still a really baby science, but we're conned into believing that it's super accurate, way more accurate than it actually is, because it's normally the food manufacturers that fund the research so that they can say how great it is and therefore sell more of their own food. But also, clever language is used in the media and in marketing to over exaggerate the benefits of each specific food. So, when you hear reduces the risk by 50%, that sounds amazing. But if your risk of getting whatever it's saving you against was only 1 in 5 million to begin with, then you're pretty fucking safe without that food anyway. There is no one single food or way of eating that's proven to have any more than just a minor impact on lifespan, despite what we're told. But that leads me to a second point when we talk about the goodness of food, and that is, do we even have the right definition of what good means to begin with? See, our culture specifically defines good as what will make you thinner and make you live forever. But that's a really biased lens to look through. Other cultures define food's goodness in completely different ways. For example, ancient Chinese medicine believes that a good food is one that helps to balance out your yin and your yang energies. To them, food is totally medicine. And in Ayurveda, food is meant to bring harmony to the mind, the body, and spirit. That's what makes a good food. And hunter-gatherers and tribal types see good food as a food type that contains the most energy, or it's got healing properties. It's only a westernized culture that has an obsession with body image and longevity, and we aren't necessarily right to believe that that is the most important thing in the universe. It's just our opinion. And we often forget that we're not just individual humans battling a cruel world and we're gripping on as tightly as possible to life. We forget that we're part of a much larger global community of life. And you'll find that, like the ancient native cultures, they understand this completely, and they tend to show more respect for their nature and their surroundings. And they're a genuinely active part of making sure that it's cared for and protected. Whereas we tend to see the world as a huge warehouse just full of resources put there for us to take whenever we want to. So maybe when we think about what's good to eat, we need to take more than just our own really selfish needs into account. In fact, when I think of whether a food is good or bad, I think of 4 really specific things. So let's start with ourselves as individuals. So the first thing we need to contemplate is, how does the food make us feel? Because we really need to pay attention to this. So why is it that we're eating what we're eating? Is it because a food label or some random women's health magazine tells us that it's good, or because it actually makes us feel good? So a few months ago, I did a diet challenge where I ate nothing but super ultra processed food, but food that was advertised as good for me. And I've never felt so shite in my entire life. We also need to remember that we often use food to cover up our hard emotions that we don't want to feel, which sometimes is really, really great. It's a really good plan, but it's definitely not a long-term solution. So in that one moment, it could be counted as good, but is it then afterwards as well? And of course, there's a whole section of foods which are just designed to be overeaten, like the snack type foods. They're created in a lab very specifically to override your common sense and your body's natural wisdom when it comes to how much food we need to eat. And the food companies don't care whether the food is good for you in any type of way. They only care that it's good for their profit margin. And when you eat it, and when it's lighting up the hedonistic taste values in your brain and it tastes amazing, then it's really, really good. But again, does it continue to be really good? The second thing that we need to consider is whether the food that we're choosing to eat fits into our lifestyle. So that means, our time, our budget, our effort, our skill levels. So are we telling ourselves that we don't have time to cook, even though we're spending 4 hours watching TV each night, or vice versa? Are we missing out on precious time with our loved ones because, we're insisting on spending 3 hours a night cooking everything from scratch? Are we buying organic food, which is causing us tons of issues about whether we can pay our other bills? Or alternatively, could we afford to spend a little bit more on the food quality than we are already? So could you, for example, buy your meat from a local farm instead of a supermarket? So we need to figure out what's important to us and what out of that constitutes good. Number three is, interestingly, how much does the food make you move? Convenience and comfort have turned into these absolute life goals in our culture, but actually, looking at that as the most important thing means that we might be missing out on something really important, because food used to be our personal trainer. So in order to get the food, we had to move our bodies to get it. We naturally balanced out our energy and we made sure that we moved enough to satisfy any health needs that we had. So, get our heart and our lungs moving and our muscles working hard. But now we can get all the energy we want without even moving a muscle. And this might sound really insignificant, but it's just little things like being able to get sliced bread means that we're not using energy in cutting it. And all of us owning food processors means that we don't have to mix by hand anymore. And processed meals are generally a lot softer and need far less chewing than adults actually should be doing. And all of these tiny movements day after day after day after day are likely to have an impact as we miss out on the types of movements that our bodies are designed to do. So convenience could genuinely be making you less able to function as a human. Now, I do have to put a disclaimer in here because I know that these types of foods are genuinely really important to some groups of people, and that's awesome. Of course, they should totally exist. But instead of consuming them because we have to, because we have no other choice, because we're in those groups, a lot of us just eat them just because they're there and because it satisfies our need to be lazier. And so maybe good food is food that makes us move more before we have to eat it. And finally, we need to remember that this isn't just all about us. There are so many parts of things like intuitive eating that I really, really like. However, one of the bits that I really can't square with is that it seems to be all about us. And there seems to be very little concern about how our food choices affect the world that we live in. So a quote that I really, really love is something like, the food that we eat is not only a personal choice, but that it is really intimately linked with everything around us, and that our personal choices genuinely do have global consequences. So a really good example of this is food like quinoa. Like, is it really good for us if it means that when we eat it, we're destroying rainforests by overplanting it, but we're also killing off local economies because we're raising the price of their staple food so that we can get our superfood? And are things like avocados really good for us when we have to fly them halfway around the world purely for the intention of increasing our good fats in our diet? And whilst obviously it is cool to say everything in balance and all food is good food and eat whatever the fuck you want, whenever the fuck you want to eat it, I do genuinely think it's important that we are at least aware of the negative impact that our mass production is having on the planet. Because every single one of our Western food calories, they reckon, takes 10 calories to make it through like the machinery and the transportation and the destruction of nature and the cheap labour. And it's a really unsustainable system. And maybe just following our taste buds or our personal health demands isn't helping to balance out that unsustainability. So I think that it's time that we stop judging a diet based purely on our perceptions of its health benefits and instead looked at it in terms of how it suits our lifestyle and the sorts of impact that we want to have on the world. And you get to decide what that means for you. Start with what kind of world you would like to live in. So, for example, in my perfect world, I would like for my food choices to have as minimal impact as possible on the environment. But equally, I know that I have to balance that out with my budget and the availability of food that I can get hold of. I would love to live in a world where my food contains zero processing or chemicals and is always cooked from whole ingredients, possibly sung over by unicorns or birds or whatever. But I also have to balance that out with the knowledge that all food that we eat now has been modified in some way. and that sometimes the amount of time that I have to cook food is a really important factor in my life as well. I would love to be able to honour my completely hedonistic side all the time and eat snacks whenever the fuck that I want, but I have to balance that with the knowledge that the types of foods that I would like to eat all of the time are really high in energy, and my body probably hasn't evolved to eat them in large amounts, and that foods like that are designed to be overeaten. I also need to remember that foods like that are they mostly have a reasonably large impact, a negative impact on the planet because they're mostly hugely highly processed. So this is always a really, really delicate balance between a whole ton of factors, and there is never all or nothing. It's all about a bigger picture, but not necessarily the balance that's promoted in our society between good and bad and healthy and unhealthy, because I think it's way bigger than that. I think when we start to think about food as more than just what will keep us healthy, we instead need to look at it more holistically in terms of what's good for our local community as well as our global health. And that if we do that, then we might start to make different food choices without any force or willpower required, because our habits and the decisions that we make are based on the type of people that we see ourselves as being, the type of people that we want to be, and the type of world that we want to help create. And you get to decide what that means for you. You get to choose how you want to show up in the world and what sort of person it is that you want to be. Because there's genuinely no good or bad here, it's all a huge continuum. And often our choices are made based on the amount of privilege that we're each afforded, and that's okay. There's no such thing as one person doing better than another person, as long as every single person is doing the very best that they can. And there's only ever the best that we can do, each in the different varying situations that we're each presented with. So I'd say in a perfect food world, good food is us all aiming for that.